Every time you find yourself here, it's because you chose to come back. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We are in episode 4 of season 8, and we are continuing a new series that we just might not ever escape from. We're talking all about trapped horror.
All right, so first things first, you probably noticed that Mel is not joining us today. We miss her desperately, and we can't wait for her to come back. But yeah, Matt and I have some exciting things to talk about because in this episode, we're continuing our discussion about trapped horror. And we wanted to talk specifically about workplace trapped horror, which I kind of feel like is the new trapped in domesticity horror. We can talk about that a little bit. So, in previous episodes, and talking about ways people can feel trapped, we've brought up Shirley Jackson, right? You know, she has long track record of talking about all sorts of different types of people getting trapped in houses, or feeling trapped by your neighbors, having, I mean, really a fear or a hatred of your neighbors in a lot of her books. So she really kind of, I think, starts a lot of that trapped in suburbia that has become so ubiquitous in horror. Of course, we have books like The House of Leaves, which we've talked about on this podcast, which I think definitely fits. But then there seems to be a little bit of a shift. We still are seeing a lot of domestic and suburban horror, especially in this trapped subgenre. But I feel like lately we're seeing a trend towards the corporate workplace, and that makes sense for a lot of reasons. I think it's something, well, we're going to explore in this episode. So the opening quote was from the TV show Severance on Apple TV. I will warn you now, Matt and I are big fans of Severance. So this episode will contain spoilers for season 1 of Severance. That's just a warning. Some of the other things we talk about, we're going to try to avoid spoilers with that. But yeah, let's just start, I guess, talking a little bit about this idea of domestic and workplace horror. Matt, what do you think about that? Do you agree with my thesis that that this kind of like corporate workplace horror seems to be overtaking uh, what we used to have with like suburban trapped horror?
I do. I definitely think we have seen an uptick in this kind of horror stories, and I I know you've mentioned Severance, which we're going to really dive into as kind of our big main one, but there are other examples as well, and not even just horror, but even sort of horror adjacent that really show how mind-numbing or desensitizing or just plain dreary and dreadful the workplace can be. And you listeners may not have been privy to this, but I know Mel and Lisa heard a lot of my venting. But I very recently just left a very corporate job for a very similar job in a much less corporate environment. And I'll be honest, I don't know that I could be happier. I've I feel so much better in a number of ways, but this podcast is not going to be about my workplace grievances from my prior job, but I think it is something that really, from the 1950s onward, has become more and more of something that has gone from novel to mundane to almost downright oppressive in some ways. I mean, corporate cultures are very homogenistic, I guess, if you will, and it's very difficult to feel like you're unique or appreciated or even seen in those sorts of situations in a lot of cases. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, even if you don't work in an office uh, like in Severance. Even if you work in something like a retail job, there's a lot of those same sort of corporate structures, especially if you're working at a chain that is a corporate retail, like, working at Walmart or, um, even like store in a strip mall or anything like that. They can still feel very corporate and very similar in the environment, to an office place. And honestly, there's very little difference in what I do in my office job doing support for customers. It's very similar to a retail job in the fact that you have to deal with insane and or stupid requests. But anyway, yeah, I have noticed, uh, as you said, kind of independently, that there has been this growth of exploration of the workplace and the parts of it that make us miserable. And honestly, I think a good part of it has been, this is going to I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound weird or wrong, but it might be a good thing to come out of the quarantine period from COVID, because all of the working from home and the isolation and quarantine really, I think, helped expose people to how different things can be. Because, working 9 to 5 in an office at a desk versus working from home, even doing the same thing, can be very different and feel very different, even if you're doing practically the same thing. So I would add to your thesis that I think part of the growth might be because of 2020 and the quarantine and pandemic time, um, giving us the space to really reflect on what those environments have been like for the last 50 plus years.
Yeah, I really I really like what you were saying there, because I think you're right in pinpointing like 2020 as being one of the turning points, I think, for how we view corporate culture. I know just for me, like I can look back on some jobs I had pre-pandemic, and sometimes they seem wild to me when I think about the things we had to do. Like I was laughing the other day, thinking about when I worked at a bank, and I had to wear, like, I had a fairly strict dress code, because they wanted us to look professional, which I completely understand. But it was one of these things where it was like, women have to wear, skirts of a certain length, closed toed shoes that were heels of a certain like height, and like pantyhose or stockings of some kind. I don't know. It was just really wild when you think about it, because I was like, most of the time people were seeing me from behind a desk. So they never really saw me from the waist down, but there there were all these rules about what you could and could not wear, and the length of everything, the height of everything. It was just crazy. And I think that's one of the things that people are looking at, specifically with like corporate culture, is some of the rules that now I think feel very arbitrary. Um, as far as, you have to be here from certain hours to certain hours, especially like I understand if you're working a customer facing job where you need to be there at certain hours. But there were certainly some jobs I worked that did not require that. Where I could do my job at any time, anywhere, as long as I met the deadline. Um, and it was crazy to me when people would say, no, I need you in your at your desk from like 9 to 5 every day. Regardless of whether you have work in front of you, you need to be sitting in that desk. And I think people are starting to look at that as, well, why are we doing this? You know, why do we feel like we have to do this? I mean, really, when you think about it, you know, you dialed into the term like corporate, which I kind of want to talk about a little bit uh, with this theme, because a lot of times in this type of like trapped horror, it's the corporation that is the big evil entity, right? Certainly, we'll talk about a few examples of that, but when you really look at corporate culture from the outside in, it shares a lot of similarities to when we talked about cult horror. You know, there's certainly like a group think going on. Um, there's this idea, Matt, you mentioned the word like homogenize, this idea to make everything similar, which, by the way, is the exact same as like suburban trapped horror, right? That's the idea, is that everything looks the same. But even the idea that you have to adopt a certain way of speaking, certain terms that you have to start using that mean different things inside the company versus outside the company. And that's how you can kind of tell who's in and who's out. There's a very like us versus them mentality. And I think people feel like they get lost in that, in the same way that you would in a cult, right? The individual becomes erased, and you're going to do what's best for the group, but not necessarily what's best for you. And usually the group, I'm using air quotes even though you can't see, um, usually the group is whoever is leading it, right? And it's the same way in a type of corporate work environment. Like those people you brought up about like Walmart, for instance. Like, yeah, you might not be working a corporate office job if you're a greeter at Walmart, for instance, but you're still under that corporate umbrella, and you're working for the people who, you know, who head up the company. Like, you're working to make them money. They don't necessarily care about you. They don't care if you you know, anything really that's happening in your life. If you can't do your job, then you're going to be let go. So there's this idea that I think, not just the loss of identity, but this like feeling that you're giving your life over to something that doesn't care about you. Like it's very sinister when you start to kind of peel back the layers to it. So I can see how it really is a rich ground for horror. And I think especially with 2020 and everything that's happened since, and people really questioning whether or not they want to go back to their same jobs, whether or not they want to go back to the office, even as corporations are telling them no is now mandatory. I think we're going to see a real uptick in this. So it's a horrible thing that's going on, but it's exciting, at least from this creative standpoint.
Oh, it absolutely is. And I'm going to sort of latch on to something you were kind of circling around, just to, I want to draw this out a little bit, but um, I definitely think one of the parts of workplace horror in particular is going to be sort of the facelessness of the corporation itself. I mean, even if you work for a company, you're going to have a boss that you direct to, or that you report to, some sort of, you know, direct supervisor or something like that. They're going to have a boss. They're going to have a boss all the way up until you get to the president or the CEO. But the company itself is always a faceless sort of thing. Like, most people are not going to have any day-to-day interactions with the CEO and aren't really even going to think of them as the company, unless it's kind of an outlier, like when Steve Jobs was at Apple. I mean, he was such a cult of personality that people kind of associated Apple and him together. But, you know, I don't think most people could name the CEOs of a lot of corporations, but you could name the corporation itself. And so it almost abstracts it to the point of this facelessness and, well, bureaucracy too. Uh, and that, I mean, we've seen that horror go all the way back to Franz Kafka's The Trial, where he gets stuck in this like corporate, well, not corporate, but government bureaucracy, where he's accused of a crime that he didn't commit but can't ever escape the charges because of the bureaucracy. You could easily see something similar happening in a corporate sort of setting. And I do think a lot of corporations tend to view their workforce, especially at the lower levels, as fairly replaceable and interchangeable, even if it's something that does require a fairly specialized skill set. And I mean, that's something that's always kind of blown my mind. You know, in the industry that I work in, the a lot of the times it takes a while to really learn and understand the industry, and as well as what exactly your role is in it, and that sort of thing. And it's not something you can just pick up within a week or two. It's like 6 to 8 months before you're really, really good and competent. Not to say that this is difficult, but it's just complex. And um, I definitely got the sense that people would be let go with the idea that, oh, well, we can just hire somebody to replace you. But in some cases, you can't, or at least not quickly or easily, um, because it's not an interchangeable part. It's not like, oh, you just plug somebody into the assembly line and tell them to pull this lever every 30 seconds, which even still, I mean, even on an assembly line, there's going to be some level of critical thought. Like, what if the machine breaks down? What if this? What if that? What if that? So I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good place for the horror to come from, is being stuck in this faceless bureaucracy where, I mean, you get a paycheck every 2 weeks and it comes from someone from somewhere in some magical place called HR. But I mean, who is Walmart? Who is Microsoft these days? It, who is Google? Like, it's not one person. It's its own environment. And I think cult is a really good description for it. I don't think we have to use cult as a bad word or as a pejorative, but there definitely are these elements of, like you said, groupthink, or placing the group and its needs above yourself. I've seen way too many people give way too much of their free time for a company that didn't really care or return any appreciation back. Um, so yeah, I don't know. That's a long, rambling way of saying I completely agree. And the facelessness of it is, I think, a big important part that we've probably known for a long time, but we haven't really, as a culture, delved into that with our horror in a way that it feels uncharted in some ways, or needs to be explored more, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it really does, because when you think about, I think also from the flip side about it is why like an individual would feel trapped in that environment is because our society has built it up to be a necessity, right? I mean, as you hit on it, Matt, again when we were talking about it, but you said somebody somewhere is sending you a paycheck, and I thought, well, yeah, that's it. It's become a, I do this in exchange for a paycheck. Like this is now our relationship, is I do this, you pay me. But I've also noticed that they they quote unquote, the kind of the corporate voice, I guess if we want to call it, will often say, um you don't need to do this just for the paycheck. Like they want you to, and again, I'm drawing from personal experience, which I won't like delve into in this podcast because it's not the point. But I've been in jobs or been in job interviews too, where especially when I've pushed back on like salary negotiations, for instance, where people have said, oh, well, you don't do this for the money, or you shouldn't let it be all about the money, as if that was somehow bad on my end. As if I was saying some sort of like dirty, sinister word because I asked for what I was worth. Um, you know, it never wants to be that way. The corporation, I think, will sell you the lie that, they care about you, that everybody's a family here. We're a family company. We take care of you like our own. When in reality, none of that is actually happening. But they want their employee to buy into that and not just be there for the paycheck. Um, I don't know. It's really kind of interesting, and I agree. I think it hasn't been explored quite enough. It's been explored a little bit, so we're going to talk about some of these because I could kind of get into the ins and outs. I'm really interested in this kind of corporate environment as cult. Uh, I'm really interested in it, but that's not the entire point about all of this. So first, I think a good place to start would be the 2019 film Vivarium. Now, this is not a corporate or workplace horror, but I think I wanted to at least mention it since we started this off by talking about domestic horror, because I think this is a good example of the way people today are using that kind of domestic trapped horror that Shirley Jackson was so good at, specifically like the suburban horror, which I think, again, suburbia and corporate America feel like they go together so well. Those two things are really parasitic in their relationship. But I won't go too deep into this, Matt. I know you haven't seen Vivarium. It stars Imogen Poots and Jesse Eisenberg. It was directed by Lorcan Finnegan. I hope I just said that right. But it's about this couple who are looking for a home. Like, they're out there looking for a new home to buy, and they meet a real estate agent. They find a real estate agent quite literally like off the street. They walk past his office and decide to go in and kind of see what he has. And he says he wants to take them around this new suburban development, where the houses are just going up, and he thinks they might be interested in seeing it, and so they go. And basically, it's they find themselves in one of these places where every house looks exactly the same. Every yard looks exactly the same. Every street looks exactly the same. And of course, you can imagine what happens. The real estate agent leaves them there, and they find that they're trapped. And no matter how many times they try to find their way out of the neighborhood, they can't. It's kind of one big like maze structure. That's just the beginning. It gets increasingly weirder from that point on. It's really terrifying. It's horrifying in weird ways. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but I will just say, Matt, I think you need to watch it. And listeners, if you haven't seen this movie, it's it's not a perfect film, but man, was it weird and unsettling. And I think a really good example of this kind of like trapped in suburbia horror. And it has, I think, that the same like corporate coldness that we've been talking about. The same idea of a loss of individuality, a feeling like you're replaceable. That's all I'll say. So, yeah, definitely check that movie out.
Well, I know you've brought it up before on the podcast, and I made a note of it at the time, but I definitely like double underlining it and highlighting it now to watch Vivarium, possibly as early as this weekend, because every time you bring it up, I remind myself, wow, that really does sound like something right up my alley. And I think you're right too about suburbia and corporate. culture being sort of parasitic and even symbiotic to each other, because I mean suburbia really developed at the same time as the modern corporate workplace that we think of in the post World War II, really in the 1950s and 60s. And I mean, I think of it's not a perfect show by any means, and goodness knows I stopped watching somewhere in the second season. But the opening of the show Weeds, where they show suburbia playing that song, "Little Houses on the Hillside, Little Houses Made of Ticky Tacky," like these little pop up houses that are all the same, sort of cookie cutter. Everybody living in them is in their own way also kind of fake, or at least sort of trapped. I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of overlap between the trapped nature of suburbia and the trapped nature of that corporate culture that we've been talking about. And I mean, Vivarium definitely sounds like an interesting exploration of it. And I know you've been definitely trying to avoid any sort of spoilers, so I do appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm trying to just entice rather than spoil, but I will say, I think you're right in saying, that we really did see suburbia and corporate America kind of coming up at the same time. And going into their kind of parasitic relationship. I mean, number one, we used to have company towns, where a corporation would own a town and the people would live there, and they would work for the same company that they then owed everything to. So it became literally a I'm trapped here, because if you lost your job, then you lost your home and your neighborhood and your neighbors, and your entire life structure would kind of crumble along with it. And there was a reason we moved away from that. But I'm even hearing now that some of the companies are wanting to try it again, right? Like I could totally see an Amazon or Google or something be like, oh, we're going to have a town where everybody lives here and works for us, and it's going to be wonderful. But really, it is so sinister. And then there's also just the economic implications too. Even when your suburban home and your job is completely separate, they're constantly feeding each other, right? Um, you're always going to want the nicer house, the nicer car. That's the way our society is set up. So therefore, that indebts you to your job and makes you stay there. So yeah, they are absolutely intertwined in a really I keep using the word sinister, but that's all I can really think about today. I feel like we've been dancing around it. We might as well just start talking about Severance, because I can't think of a better example of corporate horror and selling yourself to a sinister company than Severance. So again, just like I said at the beginning, spoilers abound for this one. Matt, I know you really enjoy Severance. So do you have any initial thoughts on it, especially as it relates to what we've been talking about?
Enjoy is a tough word to use with Severance, because um, it's a brilliant TV show, but there are definitely plenty of moments throughout the first season where it is so excruciatingly, weirdly uncomfortable to watch that listeners, those of you that have not seen it, I really, like Lisa said, there's going to be plenty of spoilers. So I would recommend maybe watching it and then coming back to this episode if you haven't seen it and are wanting to remain spoiler free. But one of the things about Severance itself is just how uncomfortably awkward and weird it is in a lot of places. And yeah, so anyway, sorry, I sort of began with a digression there, because it's a brilliant show. I cannot wait for the next season of it. But it's not something I would say I enjoyed every second of. That's for sure. It made me very uncomfortable at places. But I mean, I guess my opening thoughts are that, well, first of all, uh, Adam Scott, his his performance in this show is absolutely incredible. Everyone is great. Everyone is phenomenal, but like he really, really showed his range as an actor to me. Like I was floored by how good he is at this show. Um, and I mean, I've been a fan of his for pretty much since I saw him in Parks and Rec. But um, yeah, this I mean, he's incredible. But as far as the show itself, just for as a quick recap, or for those of you that haven't seen it and are staying with us, the idea is that these people that work for this corporation, and we're not really told much about it. We also don't know exactly what they do, but they undergo this sort of procedure that severs their brain into two different parts: the part that is them when they are not at work, and the part where they are at work. So when they're at work, they have no memories of their outside life. They don't know who they are beyond basics like their name, but they don't remember if they have a family. They don't remember where they live or their past or their history. They only know their history as it relates to them working in this office. And vice versa, when they leave the office, they have no memory of what they've done at work whatsoever. They don't know anything about it. And I mean, first of all, I mean, you mentioned the sinister nature of something like a company town, and possibly seeing Amazon, or I could even see some other companies as well, trying to get in on that bandwagon. If this were a technology that existed today, I could absolutely see corporations trying to use that. We're going to increase productivity because you won't have any memories of, if you had a bad day before you got to work, you won't remember it. You'll just do your best at work. But the show itself really explores all the sinister implications of that, and what it what it does to someone, and what it means to really have two identities: one you at work and one you outside of work. um I don't know, I mean, that's kind of the nutshell explanation of the show itself, and it gets increasingly weirder the more you see what they're doing in the office, because it's never explained exactly what they're doing. All of the equipment and even the architecture seems very dated, very like 1970s ish, or Soviet era kind of technology. If you've seen the show Loki but you haven't seen this, it very similar overlaps in terms of the technology that they use. And we have no idea, even as us viewers, what it is they're actually doing at this job. It's made to be important, but we don't know what it is yet. But yeah, I'll that I mean, I love it. I think it's a great show. It's Well, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Lisa, to kind of give your initial thoughts on it too before we really dig into it. But yeah, that's kind of my initial overview.
No, I think that that's really great. And I agree with everything that you said. Like Adam Scott, this is his best role. This may be everybody's best role in it though. Like it's everything is so good. Yeah, I think the initial idea is intriguing because I agree. If this were a technology that were available today, I can see not just corporations wanting to do it, but people lining up to want to do something like this because isn't that always what all of us are striving for is work life balance? I mean, how often do you hear people talk about that phrase, right? This idea that you've got to work to live, but not live to work. And you've got to maintain your relationships with your friends and family outside of work, and maintain yourself as a whole person, and get to enjoy your life before you get too old to do so, that you can go out and you can enjoy yourself without having the stress of work like hanging over your head. And to be able to separate that so cleanly, I think would be appealing to a lot of people. I think it would especially be appealing, this idea of, if you're, and I know this is going to sound weird if you haven't watched the show, but bear with me. uh, Even though it is the same person going to work and going home, it really is kind of two different people, because there's a memory gap, right? So the person going to work, well, I'll get there in just a minute. The person who's living life outside of work has no memory of work. So you would essentially drive to work in the morning at 9 a.m., and then in the snap of a finger, it's 5 p.m. in the evening, and you're ready to go home. You skipped over all of the boring, mundane, yucky parts that nobody wants to do, right? But you still get to enjoy the benefits and the paycheck, and go home and live your life. But and as you pointed out, this show explores it so well, because there's also that other side of you. So if there's the person living outside of work, there's the person living in work. And for that person never gets days off, never gets vacations, never gets to know what's happening outside of work, because all they know is they come in the morning, they do their job, they go home, and then in the snap of a finger, it's the next morning and they're back. They've changed clothes, maybe they've changed their hair, but that's it. And they have no memory of the outside world. So they don't know if they have like a kid that they're thinking of, or, any of this, which would be appealing to a corporation, right? You get a good worker. But it also kind of plays into that sinister nature of it, right? Because as the show explores, number one, they don't know fully what they're working towards. They're never really given the full breadth of the company. And because they don't have the like social structures that normally we have outside of work, all of that gets built into work. So the corporation takes on really cult status, because there's almost like a hero worship. It's almost a religion that's built in this show around like the founder of the company, and the lore, because that's all they're really told is, this kind of like legendary founder and everything he stood for. And he's spoken about in very like reverent language. But rituals start to pop up. If you do so much, you earn different things. Um, and then relationships begin to form within the workplace too, which is only natural, because that's what we want to do as humans, is form these relationships. But then when you're on the outside, you don't have those. So it's really a fascinating show, I think, exploring like why that would be a terrible idea, but also pulling back the curtains on some of the problematic areas that are present in any workplace.
Well, and I want to latch onto something that you were saying too about how you never get a sense of what they do or what the company does. And for me, it really like the compartmentalization of what happens in Severance is just it's it's such a good microcosm of not just corporate culture, but I was even thinking of just recently. well, I may say recently, it was now several months back probably, but Oppenheimer came out, Christopher Nolan's movie, and one of the things about the Manhattan Project that in order to, have secrecy during the war, they compartmentalized it down so that ideally there were different sections that were working on different parts of the atomic bomb that didn't know what each other were doing, for secrecy and security's sake. And that same sort of thing seems to be happening in Severance, except it's a corporate model, but we don't know what it is that they're doing. And in fact, what they do is, I believe they call it, macro data recovery, but it's basically just staring at this old computer screen, like CRT computer screen that, if I remember right, is almost, it's either green and black or black and white, and just kind of staring at numbers until something makes them feel uncomfortable, and then they isolate it and move it out. That's meaningless. Like, that's gibberish to us, even as the viewer watching this. So it really brings up, like, what are they compartmentalized from? What is this corporation doing? And how bad is it? Because it really does give off these really sinister vibes. Whenever anyone asks questions about what they're doing or what it means, they get shut down or punished. I mean, they are completely discouraged from not just talking about it, but questioning what it is that they do with each other, with their bosses. I mean, it's this almost culture of secrecy that, I mean, anytime there's something like that where questions are not only not allowed but can be punished, really seems like something, not good is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when the show kind of, when you start to realize as the season goes on that Lumen, that's the corporation, ca- has, I mean, best I can describe them as spies on the outside. So the people who are supposed to have this complete separation, this like perfect work life balance, don't have that at all, and they don't know. So it kind of goes back to that idea of secrecy too, but that the corporation really has its fingers in everything, not just like it's overstepping its bounds on every level. It's a really really wonderful show. There's so much more I want to say, but I also, even though I know we put up spoilers, Matt, I don't want to spoil too much if our listeners have not watched this show, because there are such great reveals over the course of season one. And I will say too, one thing that really surprised me, but Ben Stiller directs a lot of the episodes in season one, and I did not know that he was kind of making the move into becoming a director, but he blew me away.
Same. I had seen a few other things that he had directed. I think that he actually directed the movie that he was in, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which, not a great adaptation of the short story, but I actually really enjoyed that film for what that's worth. But that's a bit of a digression. I also, going into Severance, did not realize that he directed, I think if not all, it was a majority of the episodes, of the season. And yeah, he is really good. Like, he his use of color in Severance everything is so very, especially when they're in the office, very stark, very antiseptic, almost monotone, but not quite, but just very, like, it just nails the, like, corporate environment that is just completely sterile, and um, to the point where like they barely even have anything on their desks, and the only thing that they have on their desks are like the awards that they've gotten for being good workers. Which, of course, you know, since they have no memory of their outside lives, it makes sense. But it's also, imagine if I said that, but like the plot point of them having the severed memories was not a key point. That would be really weird if you worked in a place where you weren't allowed to have anything on your desk except for things like awards that you had won at work. That's, I mean, we keep circling around the word cult. You've brought it up at the beginning, but I mean, very cult like. It's definitely going to help um, breed conformity and uniformity. That's for sure. But yeah, I mean, like his use of colors and framing of shots and all those sorts of things, just very good, very very good.
You know, when we were looking up or researching, I guess, for this episode, I knew I wanted to kind of focus in on corporate horror and feeling trapped in the workplace. Um, and I knew we were going to talk a lot about Severance, especially once I knew it was Matt and I kind of running this episode because I know that we're both fans of it. But we, I think we're surprised in the what we came up with as far as like the best workplace horror, because we found some recommendations for best workplace horror that were just absolutely unhinged. I don't think um, there's really like a uniform definition of what workplace horror is, except that if it's a horror movie that takes place where someone works, I guess it counts. Which is not what we're talking about. We're really drilling in, I think, to this idea of feeling trapped in the same way you would feel trapped in a cult, or this evil corporation that has promised you a utopia that turns out to be anything but, you know. So I kind of want to put that out there. Like, we found this list on Screenrant. Normally I love Screenrant, so I don't want to make this sound like we're ragging on them at all, but they were listing things like The Thing, or um The Autopsy of Jane Doe, or Pontypool, which all are great movies. Those would all be, you know, high on my list of like great horror movies. But just because it takes place at somebody's work doesn't make it what we're talking about here. I think a um, much better uh, example, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Sorry, I'm a bit brain dead tonight. But is a movie, The Belko Experiment, which came out in 2016. There was also a movie called Mayhem, which came out in 2017, which was a Joe Lynch film. But the Belko Experiment is really interesting. It's completely different, I think, in tone from Severance, but it plays into that idea of being promised something that is maybe too good to be true, and an evil corporation not really delivering on it. So again, I don't want to spoil it. You can probably tell if you look up any of the like images from the film. The poster has somebody in like a white button down, like typical corporate garb, and there's blood splattered everywhere. Like it's a very, very much kind of like people are trapped in a building, and the bloodshed starts very early. Um but I don't know, it's kind of a fun one. It's not, I don't think it's quite as, like, how do I say this nicely, it's not quite as smart as something like Severance, but it's a fun watch.
Since you brought up that Screen Rant list, and yeah, just to echo what you're saying first, no shade at Screen Rant. They generally do a pretty good job. I mean, they are a little listicle, but this particular one, yeah, that it was a little. Loose. We'll go with loose in their definition of workplace horror. I just wanted to add that I think my favorite movie that they included on this list of workplace horror, and I'm repeating this for a reason, was the movie Day of the Dead, which, yeah, that Day of the Dead, the George Romero apocalyptic zombie movie that takes place in a missile silo. We were talking about this before we started recording, and I think the best we could come up with, I think that was you, Lisa, that said that, well, maybe it's because it focuses around the army. But like, and that's kind of a job.
Yeah, I I don't know really where they were going with that Day of the Dead one at all. They did mention it some that I thought could kind of, if like I squinted, like the cabin in the woods. That I think that certainly fits the idea, like the aesthetic. I think of like this evil corporation and people working for it and doing something that is unexpected, especially on the open, because it opens on people in a workplace and really changes, I think, your perception of it. And then there's something like Mayhem, which stars Stephen Yun and Samara Weaving. So I think just for that, that might be worth looking into. It's a horror comedy, so a little bit different from what we're talking about. But I don't know. I'm really excited to see what the next few years brings about with this type of thing, because I feel like we're going to see more films exploring this and like the horror inside of it. And I'm definitely excited for Severance season 2. So we'll be looking for that. Well, if there was maybe a corporate workplace trapped horror that is your favorite that maybe we missed, because I know we didn't cover them all. We just talked about the ones that were at the forefront of our minds, but we would love to hear from you. We're across social media at No Fear Cast. So we're on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. The music by Nicholas Gasparini. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.